Hey there, welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about something super important for all Spring Boot developers: exception handling. We'll cover everything you need to know to manage errors smoothly and keep your applications running perfectly. So, stay with us, and let's jump right in. We've built an API to fetch employee details from our database. But what happens if someone tries to get details for an employee who doesn't exist? In this case, we need to throw an exception to handle it properly. For example, let's say someone tries to fetch details for an employee with ID 999, but there is no such employee in our database. Instead of our application crashing or returning meaningless data, we should throw a resource not found exception. This way, we can return a clear and helpful message indicating that the employee was not found. Currently, our getEmployee method lacks exception handling. We're directly fetching from the employee map and returning the result. If there's no data in the map, it just returns null. But this doesn't clearly tell us that the employee ID doesn't exist, which can be really confusing. Alright, let's tackle this. First things first, we'll rename our getEmployee method to getEmployeeById. This will help us avoid any mix-ups with our getEmployees method and make our code much clearer. As you can see on my screen, our getEmployeeById method is simply fetching the employee object from the employee map and returning it. Let's make some changes. First, we'll check if the employee ID exists in the employee map. If it doesn't, we'll throw an employee not found exception. If it does, we'll fetch the data from the map and return it. Great. We've thrown the exception, but what happens next? How will our API respond? Will Spring handle it gracefully? Let's find out. Start the application server. The application server is up and running. Now, let's open Postman. Okay. Let's put our getEmployeeById API to the test. We're going to fetch details for employee ID 10. Now, we know our employee map doesn't have an employee with ID 10. So, what's going to happen? Let's find out. As you can see on the screen, Spring Boot has handled the exception, returning a response with a timestamp, status, path, and error message. But the response doesn't clearly state that the employee isn't in our database. We need to customize our exception handling to make this clearer. So, how do we do that? Let's roll up our sleeves and dive into custom exception handling to improve our API's responses. One way to handle this is by adding a try-catch block directly in our getEmployeeById API to catch the exception and return a proper response. But hold on. As you can see on the screen, our updateEmployee API also throws the same exception. This means we'd have to handle the same exception in multiple places, leading to a lot of duplicate code. So, is there a smarter way to handle the employee not found exception in just one place for all methods in our employee controller? Absolutely. Let's explore how we can centralize our exception handling to keep our code clean and efficient. Ready to see some magic? Spring Boot provides a powerful feature for exactly this purpose: the @exception_handler annotation. With @exception_handler, we can centralize our exception handling in one place, eliminating the need for repetitive try-catch blocks across multiple methods. Alright, let's dive right in. First up, we need a class to structure the response we'll return when an exception occurs, similar to how Spring Boot returns its error responses. Create a new class in the response package name this class status. In this class, we'll include a status code to contain the specific status code for the API response. A message to provide a clear description of the error. And a timestamp to record when the error occurred. Next, we need getters, setters, and a constructor for our status class. But who wants to write all that boilerplate code, right? Luckily, Lombok comes to the rescue. By using Lombox at data annotation, we can automatically generate all the getters, setters, to string, and more with just a single line of code. It's like magic. Add at noArgs constructor and at allargs constructor annotations for no argument constructor and an all argument constructor. Now, let's write the code for our exception handler. Spring Boot provides the @exception handler annotation for this purpose. Need to set the exception we want to handle in its value attribute. In our case, we'll use it to handle employee not found exception. Next, we'll create a method named handleEmployeeNotFoundException. This method will take an employee not found exception as input and return a response entity of our status class. You can name this method anything you like, there are no constraints on the name. You can name this method anything you like, there are no constraints on the name. We've set up our exception handler for employee not found exception right inside our employee controller. Now, here's where the magic happens. Whenever any API in the employee controller throws an employee not found exception, Spring will automatically search for an appropriate exception handler. When it finds our custom handler method, it will call it to manage the exception. Now, let's define an object of our status class. Need to send a status code in our status object. Let's enhance our employee not found exception by defining a new variable for the status code and setting its value to 404. Next up, we'll pull the status code and message from our employee not found exception and set them in our status object. For the timestamp, we'll use the current time. Now it's time to send our response back. We'll pack our status object into the response body and set the HTTP status code to 404 not found, clearly indicating that the resource doesn't exist. Alright, everything's set up. Now, let's start the application. The application is up and running. Now, let's switch over to Postman. Let's hit the same request with employee ID 10 in Postman and see how our improved exception handling performs. Look at the response. This time, we received a 404 status code and a message that says, employee with ID 10 not found. This makes it crystal clear that the employee doesn't exist in our database. Our update employee method also throws the same exception, so let's test that one too. We want to ensure our exception handling is rock solid across all our APIs. Take a look at the response. Just like before, we get a clear message indicating the issue. We see the same informative response with the 404 status code and the message telling us that the employee doesn't exist. To summarize, we've successfully implemented custom exception handling in our Spring Boot application, ensuring that our API provides clear and helpful error messages. Thank you for joining me on this journey. In the next video, we'll explore what happens when multiple controllers throw the same exception and whether different handling is required for each. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future tutorials. See you next time.